This is part 2 of part 3 of my Holocaust story. Blanche Benedict. I was born on the 20th of September 1933 and my parents named me Blanche Benedict. At the time my father owned a small factory. He was such an amazing man and he would turn his hand to anything so that he could look after his family. My mother only ever seemed to be in the kitchen. I can always remember being greeted by the smell of delicious cooking when I came home from school. I had an older brother and sister who were from my father's first marriage, and I had a younger sister who was born in Sweden. We lived in Copenhagen in a second floor flat in an area that was mostly Jewish. Our home was a traditional Jewish home, and every Friday night we would light candles. We only went to the synagogue at festival times instead of going every Saturday. Excuse me. We also stuck to the special dietary rules at home before the war started. My memories of the festival of Passover are quite clear. I remember that my grandfather would always go through every prayer and every song, which took hours. I was only 10 years old at the time and we weren't ever allowed to eat until he finished, which was about 11 p.m. I can remember sitting and constantly looking at a painting on the wall. It was a painting of a table with a bunch of grapes on it, and I would sit and count the grapes. I still have that picture and I still always treasure it. As a child I loved singing, sports and playing outdoors. On Sundays I would put my dolls in my doll's pram and take them for walks with my friend Mona, who lived across the road, and she wasn't Jewish. Even though we attended different schools, we always went to school on the same tram. When I was about 7 years old, I started at a Jewish school, and I can clearly remember my first day. The first class was like nursery school. We would be taught a few things and we played with the other children, and I stayed up until I was 10 years old. When the war started and Denmark was invaded by the Germans in 1940, then we were forced into suffering the same curfews and rationing as other countries, and of course there was bombing. Whenever there was an air raid, we would all run downstairs into the cellar until it was over with. Everyone kept talking about the Jewish people all the time and how things were going to get worse for them. One day when I was called into the headmaster's office, he said to me, "You know that there's a war on?" I just answered him by saying, "Yeah, of course I do." By that time I was 10 years old, so I was fully aware of what was happening. Then he told me that Mona's mother had been to see him that day and that I had to go back to their house that afternoon. He said that my parents would be there too, so I went straight there after school. When I got there, my mother was sat crying and my father looked really worried and he was pacing up and down. Then Mona's mother told me not to worry because I was going to be staying with them for a few days. They also told me that they were going to hide me because they heard that all of the Jews were going to be rounded up. That day was in October 1943. Just like the many ordinary Danish people, Mona's parents were amazing, and they did so much to help us despite the fact that they were putting their own lives at risk. There was 8,000 Jewish people who were living in Copenhagen at the time, but only 450 were actually caught. Mona's father had a dark room because he was a very keen photographer. He told me that if I ever heard the Nazi police coming up the stairs to run into the little room and to keep very quiet. It was really scary when the police came twice. We was only able to stay there for 4 days because it was really unsafe for Mona's parents to let us stay any longer. Our aim was to go by boat to Sweden because it wasn't involved in the war, so Mona's parents arranged for a taxi to take us to the coast. Whilst we were in the taxi, my father gave me some money and told me to keep it safe in my pocket. He also told me that they were going to hide me under a rug so that hopefully I wouldn't be seen if we got stopped. Then he told me that if we were separated, I had my whole life ahead of me and I might be saved. Thankfully, we weren't stopped. When we got to the coast, we went to a big hut, which was where the fishermen kept the catch of the day. There was quite a few other Jewish people waiting there, but we were taken in the first boat because my mother was pregnant. Including a few small children, there was about 20 of us altogether. The little children had to be given sleeping tablets to stop them from crying or making a noise. It was dawn the next day when we got into the fishing boat. We were hidden under a big tarpaulin by the fishermen and then we set off. It usually took about 2.5 hours to get to Sweden, but it took 10 because the fisherman kept having to stop to throw his nets out to make it look like he was fishing. It was really uncomfortable and cramped, and we could all see lights shining from German boats. It was all really frightening, but thankfully we arrived in Sweden safely. When we arrived, we were all taken to a church that had been converted into dormitories. There was a canteen-type room where we were given a bread roll and some tomato soup. Because there was loads of people coming in by boats, we were only allowed one bowl of soup and one bread roll. During our first year in Sweden, I didn't go to school because I learned how to speak Swedish really quickly. When my baby sister was born in January 1944, I started at a nice Swedish school and I was treated really well. Because we were the only refugee family who were living in the small town, a lot of the local people helped a lot. There was a school skiing trip, but I never told anyone because I knew that money was tight. However, one day when I arrived at school, I was very surprised when I discovered someone had left a weekend case on my desk. I told my teacher that there was a case on my desk, and she said that it was for me. When I opened it, there was sweaters, socks and mittens, along with everything you needed for a winter break. I started to cry and my teacher asked me if I really thought that they'd go without me. Then my teacher gave me a small brown envelope and she told me that it was my spending money from the teachers, just the same as the other children. We lived in Sweden until the end of the war in 1945 and then we moved back to Copenhagen. We were extremely happy when we discovered that all our family had survived. When we went to our flat to see if it was still there, we discovered that our lovely neighbour, who wasn't Jewish, had rented it out during the time that we were away and they'd saved the money for us. I was able to finish my schooling in Copenhagen and I met up with all of my school friends again. I was desperate to train as a dress designer and to work for the biggest fashion house in Copenhagen. I managed to get an apprenticeship there and to qualify as a cutter and designer when I was 18. In 1952 I came to England and I met and married my late husband. I enjoy telling school children my story because I believe they can learn from my experience. In England, we all live in a multiracial society. We are all extremely lucky to be able to live in a free country where we should mix with other people and try and understand other people's culture. Just think about how amazing the Danish and the Swedish people were to me and my family. Nicole David, growing up in hiding. I was born in September 1936 in Antwerp, Belgium, and I was the only daughter of Chawa and Monique Snyder. Both of my parents were originally from Poland, but they moved to Belgium during the 1920s. Both of them had religious backgrounds. I can remember that my mother taught me all of the most important Jewish prayers, and I used to say them every night. I have very happy memories of my mother teaching me to swim in a river which was in the village where we lived, and of my father reading me bedtime stories which were about Mickey Mouse when I was a little girl. I can also remember my mother telling me off because I was eating too many sugar lumps. I could literally have eaten 30 all at once. I remember that we would go and visit our neighbours' rabbits at the bottom of the garden. However, there's an atmosphere of fear behind these memories because I was just a 4-year-old little girl when the Nazis invaded on May the 10th, 1940. When this happened, it changed my childhood years altogether. Throughout the first 2 years of the Nazi occupation, different laws were passed. They were there to restrict the movement and freedom of Jews. No Jews were allowed to run their own business, go to cinemas, go to theatres or go to parks. Because I was Jewish, I wasn't meant to attend school, but there was a nun who allowed me to go to nursery for a while. Apart from children under 6 years old, all Jews had to wear yellow stars by May 1942. Even now I can still remember how the German soldiers would inspect the stars on my parents' coats to make sure that they were sewn all right. By the time it came round to August in 1942, my parents had become incredibly worried about the safety of us all because of the Nazis sending people away to concentration camps. They decided that all of us were going into hiding, but unfortunately they couldn't find anywhere that would take all 3 of us. This left them with no option but to put me in an orphanage that was run by nuns, and it was Catholic, and they hid in an attic where they were protected by a Belgian family. During my time in the orphanage, I was very unhappy and I was only 6 years old at the time. I had never been separated from my parents before and I kept constantly getting tonsillitis. Because of this, the orphanage were unable to keep me because they didn't want the other children to become infected. Back then, antibiotics didn't exist, which meant I had to have my tonsils out. We had no choice but to go back to the place where we lived before going into hiding. The plan was that we were only going to stay there for a week so that I could have my tonsils out. However, it was decided that once I was well enough I would be hidden by a family who my mother had found. I was very happy to be home on the 7th of October 1942, which was the day before my operation. On the 7th of October 1942, which was the day before my operation, me and my father went out to buy a newspaper whilst my mum prepared lunch. The day was beautiful, so we decided to stop at a cafe by the river for a while. My father even let me have a sip of his drink. However, when we got close to home again, there was 3 German lorries outside our house. After that day, I never saw my mother again. Thankfully, me and my father managed to escape with the help of the Belgian resistance. They waited for us so that they could take us to a safe house, because they knew what had happened. The rest of our day was spent at that house whilst the Germans searched for us. Later in the evening, my father was taken back to the attic he'd previously been hiding in by members of the resistance, and they took me to stay with Monsieur and Madame Champagne. They were both Catholic and they were the parents of a neighbour that my mother had made friends with. They had 10 children of their own and 5 of them were still living at home. Despite the fact they were putting their lives and the lives of their family at risk, they took me in and took care of me. Even though it wasn't true, they pretended that I was Madame Champagne's niece, even though they could have been killed for hiding a Jew. They treated me like I was one of the family and they let me live with them for 1.5 years. They didn't take any money for looking after me. The only time I went out was when I went to church with the family. This was a great treat for me. They were asked by my mother to remind me to keep saying the Jewish prayers that she had taught me. Every night without fail, their daughter Paulette would make sure that I didn't forget. I wasn't able to go to school because it could have been dangerous if the other children asked me questions. I was a very lonely child and every day I would spend hours on end making up fantasy stories which were about an imaginary friend called Mickey. By nature I wasn't a loner. I loved being with people and chatting to them, but I had no choice but to become very independent. I had to learn to take each day as it came and to try not to think too much. However, every day I missed the warmth of my parents more and more. I can remember that on my 7th birthday I was given a special treat. There was a German Jewish girl called Yvonne who had been with us since 1938 and I was allowed to go for a walk with her. She had blue eyes and blonde hair and she worked in the local area using fake false identity papers. During the time I was waiting for her, I decided to wander off by myself. Before I knew it, I was right at the other side of the village and the whole family was looking for me. My punishment was to write I am not allowed to go out alone 250 times. After I'd been with the Champagne family for about 1.5 years, I had to leave them because of a risk of bombing nearby. I was taken to a farm which was in another village. Not long after I arrived at the farm, some Germans came. I quickly ran to my room, got into bed and pretended that I was ill. Thankfully, they weren't looking for me. They were looking for the farmer's 2 sons so they could send them to work in Germany. I was moved again after that and hidden again because it was far too dangerous for me to remain in the village. By this time people were saying that the Americans were going to come and set us free. It turned out that this was true and on the 6th of September 1944 we were liberated. One of the American soldiers jumped off his lorry and gave me a chocolate bar. I was really frightened of his uniform and I ran away. However, the family I was staying with caught up with me and explained to me that this was a friendly uniform. I was only 8 years old and I found it very confusing. It wasn't long before me and my father were reunited, but it wasn't long before we had to move again because there was still a lot of fighting going on. We moved to Brussels and we stayed there until the war was over with. Even though the war was over with, me and my father were separated again because we didn't have anywhere to live, so we couldn't stay together. This time I was taken to a convent where I was looked after by the Christian nuns. Even though my father came to visit me almost every day, this last separation was very difficult for me. I was told that the Germans had gone and all I wanted was for things to go back to normal again. Eventually our lives did go back to normal after all the chaos, but it tragically went on without our loved ones. Today when I look back at all the years I spent in hiding, I remember how frightened and bewildered I was by everything that was happening. However, I do realise now that just how many people put their own lives at risk to save me and my father. It really does show us just how much goodness there was amongst all the evilness. It just helps us all to remember that individual people can make a massive difference. Eric Hirsch, an orphan in Auschwitz. I was born on the 13th of September 1928 in a town called Sieradz in Poland, and my name is Eric Hirsch. Our town was an army town, and as children, me and my friends used to watch the soldiers marching past, and we'd walk behind them and pretend that we were soldiers too. My mother looked like she was Spanish, which I guess is because a long time ago her family had fled from persecution in Spain. She always cooked our meals and did everything for us. By trade, my father was a bootmaker, and he was always busy making boots for the army officers. I had a brother and 3 sisters. We all had a wonderful childhood, and we used to play in the forest, and we would skate on the frozen rivers in the winter. In our family, religion was important, and every Friday and Saturday night we went to the synagogue. I have clear memories of the synagogue during Jewish festival times. I always enjoyed those times, and I had a lot of fun playing with the other boys my age. The school I went to was a very good Jewish school, and I used to sing solo in the school choir. Polish was my favourite subject at school. As children, we would play bat and ball games, and during the winter I loved hurtling down big hills on my sledge in the snow. During the summer, we would go swimming in the river. I remember one day almost drowning, but thankfully someone managed to pull me out by my hair right at the very last minute. Reuben, who was the same age as me, wasn't just my cousin, he was my best friend. There was 2 of my friends who weren't Jewish. In 1939, when I was 11 years old, this happy life that I was used to started to change. Our town was already occupied by the Germans, and the Jewish school was now closed. Everyone who was Jewish had to wear yellow stars to show that they were Jewish. Eventually, every Jew was forced to move to another part of town, which was a small area known as the ghetto. All of us had to go and work for the Germans. I was taken to work in a labour camp, which was in a place called Otoshno, where I worked on a new railway line to Russia. Everyone was made to work very long hours with hardly any food or water, and we were severely beaten. However, I somehow managed to survive. Out of 2,500 people, including myself, there was only 11 people left after 18 months. After we'd finished our part of the railway, I was sent back home to the ghetto in Sieradz by the camp commander. By that time, my father had been taken away, and even today, I'm not sure what happened to him. In August 1942, about 2 weeks after I went back, all of us Jews were forced to assemble in the marketplace, and then we were all marched to a church. Then one by one we had to file out so that the Nazis could select all those who were fit for work. As I walked out, I could see 2 high-ranking officers. One of them asked me what my profession was, and I told him that I was a tailor. He told me to go back inside the church where my mother and most of my family were. A bit later on in the day, I went outside to get some water. Then I was asked what my profession was again, and again I said I was a tailor. This time I was to join a group of 150 people outside. This selection saved my life. There was 4,000 people in the church, my family including, and they were all taken to a concentration camp where they all perished. All those 150 people who were chosen to work were escorted to a ghetto in the town of Lodz. It was a terrible place which was overcrowded, and the sanitation was poor, and there was diseases and starvation. All the people that I could see were very thin and undernourished. Yet again we were all forced to work very long hours, and each day we all struggled to survive. I just felt like I was all alone. After a while I was accepted into an orphanage in Lord's ghetto. It was during my time there that I met Jeannie, who was my first love, and she made my life in the ghetto a lot easier to bear. She was such a beautiful girl who had big brown eyes and a beautiful smile. When I was with her, nothing seemed to matter, even though everything around us was drab and dirty. We carried on living this way and working really hard up until the Germans decided to start emptying the ghetto in June 1944. In August the same year, orders were made for the orphanage to be closed. Everyone was told that we were going to be resettled somewhere else. We were told to gather up our belongings and then we were all marched to the railway station. We were made to travel in a cramped cattle wagon train for 2 days and 1 night. There was about 100 people in each wagon and there was no food or water and no toilet facilities. The only thing that kept me going was the fact that I was travelling with Jeannie and I could try and look after her. When we eventually arrived at Auschwitz concentration camp, there was about 185 children from the orphanage that stepped off the train. We were all told by the Nazis to leave our suitcases and to form 2 lines, one with men and boys and the other with women and children. All 185 orphans were sent to stand with the women and children. Then all of a sudden there was a huge commotion, and whilst the officers were dealing with it, I took my chance. Me and another boy walked across to the men's side. I did this because I knew that it would be better to stand with those who were chosen for work. I managed to escape again, but all of the other children, including my beautiful Jeannie, lost their lives that day. I was one of the lucky ones because I had been selected to live and to carry on working. They shaved my hair off and then they tattooed a number on my arm, which was B7608. Then they gave me a striped uniform and sent me to the barracks. The conditions were absolutely horrendous. We were made to work hard and there was hardly any food. The only thing we had for breakfast was a tiny piece of black bread with some coffee that was made from burnt wheat. All we had at lunchtime was some watery soup that had vegetables floating in it. My job was to take care of the homes and to plough the field. My job was to take care of the horses and to plough the fields. Later I was sent on a fishing work group. By the time we reached the January of 1945, we knew that the Germans were losing the war and that the Russian army were getting closer. Excuse me. And that meant that soon we might be liberated. However, the Nazis decided to march all of us out of Auschwitz on what then became known as the Death March. It was snowing heavily and it was bitter cold, but we all had to keep walking. It was an horrible time. A few days later we were all put into railway wagons and then everyone was taken to another concentration camp which was called Buchenwald. I was kept there for 3 whole terrible months. The Nazis made the decision to empty that camp too, and they loaded us onto another train in 1945. That whole horrible journey lasted for 3.5 weeks. At the time I was only 15 years old and I just kept wondering if any of us was going to survive. At long last we arrived in Czechoslovakia on the 4th of May 1945, and then 4 days later the Russian army liberated us. I had managed to survive despite all the odds. I was brought to England 3 months later along with 300 other children. I had to climb another mountain to rebuild my life, especially when I discovered that none of my family had survived. I managed to learn to speak English and I trained as an electrician, and slowly I made a new life for myself. Eventually I got married, had 3 children, and I have 7 grandchildren. Ever since the war, I've lived and appreciated every second of my life. The end. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.